There's a poem by Bob Dylan that was adapted by Jimi Hendrix, and what we're going to do is see if we can play this, just the first chorus, and as we do that, we will, I think it's going to be here, we'll go back to the PowerPoint so you can see the lyrics, because the lyrics are right on the money for what we need to talk about. He wrote that a long time ago. Now, it's actually tempting to just let it be music today, but but let us resist the temptation. Because okay, so that's something, but the hour is getting late, my friends. So we have to be on the money right here, and speak truth as we can or as we know it, even as we don't have the ability to see all that we need to see. So basically, this is part 3, and the final part we'll be able to do here. And, in some sense, we're going to cover the subprime crisis and then talk about that in the context of power and finance. Just briefly visit shadow banking, come back to the question of power, and then we're going to take on this challenge of trying to think coherently about a transition to a different kind of global model. And we will be doing it in a way that will begin with, let's say, sort of the world as we have it before we get a little bit more radical. So, this is the state of the world as we see it right now, right? Racial violence coming, and, and we're in a world where, like, that's, there's my son, and he's with his nephew, and, that's a young man that could be made into that. So that's got to stop. And why is that? What is that fear and suspicion? Well, it's history, right? But it's also the current condition. Okay, so let's go. Just to kind of pick up the, if we think of a DJ picks up the needle and puts it down, drops it back in the record, and where we were was that we left things with the era of particle finance and competitive deregulations through all the financial centers and the creation of new funds, everybody trying to beat the markets. And this question that came up yesterday, a little bit, this question of if you have a global economy growing at 2% and you've got your financial firms and hedge funds all with activities premised on the idea that they're going to grow at 10%, or if there's a hurdle rate of return as there is in South Africa, of 25% rate of return, then what can you fund, and how's that going to work in the long term? The answer is it's not going to work in the long term. You're going to have the financial sector and financialization eat up the rest of the economy. And the thing is, it's going to do it in part, it's not a sound basis. So the basis of this growth is going to be something that perversely is called financial inclusion, but actually inclusion by paying attention not to the credit-worthy sectors and to just the rich, because you are eating away that basis. You're eating away the healthy companies, and you're eating away the small and medium enterprises. And so what you're actually doing is you are basically going to be looking for new populations to which you can lend, but they're not going to be sustainable. So it's going to be a form of predation. It's going to be predatory financing. And this is how we have to understand the subprime crisis. And this is facilitated by a new model because, you know, basically if you think about it, if you're starting to make loans that aren't sustainable, how about like all of the education loans being made in the United States, where there's all these for-profit universities, you know, universities like, for example, Trump University, where basically they take thousands of dollars from people, rip them off, give them no skills, and then these people are in debt. That's not a sustainable loan, nor is a subprime loan for reasons we'll briefly visit. And so essentially what you want to do if you're the lender that originated that loan is you want to take it and you want to move it off your balance sheet. That way you're going to stay safe while you make the world a little bit more dangerous. And you hurt some people along the way, but you don't care because you got the dollar, and it's all about the dollar in today's global economy, right? Okay, so that's where things go, and we're not going to get into a lot of detail about it, but essentially just to remind you that this could be like the old world, you know, small banks and large banks and making loans and so on, and they're funded mostly by demand deposits and other deposits. And then we move, the first step in which we move is, this is a move that basically is like a transition step. Some of the categories of banks are called thrifts. The thrifts or savings and loans, that's the name of the institutions that specialize in mortgage loans, housing loans. And the way that, you know, this is the system, this system over here, this thrift system, this is the one that collapsed in that triple crisis and that was actually used in part to fuel some of the mergers and acquisitions. And this one here, you know, what they did is they got the mortgage originators, whether they were still thrifts or if they were other banks, and then they would originate the loans and then sell the loans into a mortgage investment pool. Now, initially, in this investment pool, this was like a good solution, it seemed, because the mortgage investment pool could be funded by pension funds and trust funds, which had long-term responsibilities to make payments. So, you know, you have like a 30-year or a 20-year mortgage, and it's being supported by trust funds or pension funds that are going to need to pay out over 20 or 30 or 40 years. So it's maturity matched. It's a nice compromise. And furthermore, the way this initially worked was that the way that mortgage loans could move into this pool was that they were certified that they were good enough. Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac would these federal agencies would specify that these were qualifying loans. We call them plain vanilla mortgage. And so the plain vanilla mortgage can move over here, and that's how it moved. Now the thing is that, you know, what's going to happen as this system goes through time, well, actually this is a very successful system. By the end of the 1980s, the market for mortgage-backed securities, this market over here on the right, was the biggest securities market in the world. That's because there's a lot of Americans with a lot of housing debt, and that became a very dominant market. Keep in mind that in the frame, we have basically foreign money systematically coming across the border looking for something to buy. Nice thing about the mortgage pool is that the mortgage-backed security pays a little bit more than the Treasury, so you get a little bit more return for your investment dollar. And so that's how that works. Now, once this system is set up, though, what starts to happen is that private underwriters start to move in, and they start to see that, well, you know, if indeed this is a sustainable model, a good model, why don't we do our own underwriting and we can bring in loans that don't qualify for Fannie Mae or Ginnie Mae support and underwriting. initially it was what they call jumbo loans, just really big loans that were bigger than the maximum limits. But then they started to play with more and more precarious loans. And this thing here, this mortgage investment pool, basically has the same form as what's called a collateralized debt obligation, a CDO, or a structured investment vehicle, the SIV. And we're going to have a switch here up at the front. We got a sub coming in. All right then. And so what we have then is basically there's this principle of mortgage-backed securities. You know, you standardize, and here's the steps. There's some standardization of the instruments. You're separating who's making the loan from who's bearing the risk. The risk goes to whoever is holding who's ever got the liabilities against this asset. So the risk goes away from the banking system and goes over here. Now, what happens when that paper goes bad is another story, and that becomes one of the complications in the subprime crisis. But basically, that's how it, and so as we were saying, that's a whole system that works. Now, meanwhile, as mentioned, there's this continual evolution of more and more adventurous loans that are poured into these new forms of funding. This originate and distribute model is what they called it. And specifically, there had been problems for years wherein black people and brown people in the U.S. and yellow people and red people and lots of people who were subject to ethnic and racial discrimination couldn't get loans. And but the thing was that market was growing because there was more low-income families, there was more migrant workers, and banks, wanted the business. They wanted remittance business. They only had 3% of the market. They wanted to get in on this business, and they started to invent ways to make relationships with this low-income or financially excluded population. And so essentially they moved, and one of the things they moved to was subprime loans. Now the subprime loans, were basically, what this just means is that the household that's getting the loan does not meet the standard criterion for a plain vanilla loan. Now plain vanilla, what that meant was that the person buying the house would put a 20% down payment, and then they would ensure that the loan payment relative to your income was no more than 33%. That's called a plain vanilla loan. Now as housing prices rise, fewer people meet that 33% threshold, and also of course income is also falling. But then the other piece of it is that, if you don't have a down payment of 20% available, if you don't have savings, maybe you can borrow your down payment. So actually you're going to have like your mortgage loan, and then you're going to have your down payment loan. You're going to have loan against your house. Now, that seems precarious because you just borrowed your collateral. But if the housing prices are going up, why not do it? And actually, and furthermore, you can see that from the viewpoint of the banks involved, that basically, and the loan originators, if not banks, is that you can make loans that are going to return a higher rate of return for you, and you're going to get more fees. And basically what starts to happen is that there's this explosion of the subprime originations. In 2001, 2003, you see that 84% of all mortgage originations are subprime. In the next 3 years, 20% were subprime, and they're almost all securitized. And another factor here is that there's this hyper competition to make fee-based income, as we were talking about yesterday. Okay, need this one. And so essentially, what we have now is something that you can see looks a lot like the system we just had. Now, before we had the savings and loan over there, making the loan. Now it's going to be any kind of lender. It doesn't have to be a bank. And there's a long discussion there that we won't bother with today. But basically, it's the same form. They make a loan. They pour the loan into what now it could be a structured investment vehicle. And the way these vehicles now work is that there will be some investors, maybe hedge fund, maybe equity funds, maybe asset managers. And most of the backing for this won't come from pension funds. It'll come from basically the money market. And so, you know, we have a phenomenon where we start to have more and more debt that's funded through the money market. In fact, there's something that I don't think we're going to have a chance to come back to today, but something to keep in mind is that financial fragility is now, with this new model, going to be on both sides of the balance sheet. On the one hand, there's always financial fragility from Dymski because the loan could go bad. Like, you got people borrowing 100% of their housing price. Now, that's risky, because if the housing price goes down, then maybe those people can't pay if they lose their job. The fact that they had no savings indicates maybe there was a problem. Now, there's more to say about that. But then on the other side, just to keep the focus here on the risk, on the other side, these things are being financed with money market short-term borrowing. Now, that means that you're dependent on going out there and finding liquidity short-term to finance a long-term asset position. Now, if you go back and take a look at the Latin American debt crisis, that was exactly one of the problems there. The short-term markets blew up, and as those markets blew up, basically what then happened was that the cost of money got really, really high, and so those banks were basically that were caught in that crisis, or the banks and the savings and loans, were paying really high rates of return with lower rates of return, or excuse me, very high borrowing costs with lower rates of return on the money that they had invested. So that becomes a problem. Now, this thing, I would just comment that in what I just said, it makes it sound like the people who got subprime loans were basically people that had no economic resource, that were maybe with low income jobs, lower income jobs, or maybe they were people, you could think, that had no savings. What I want to say, though, is that, again, I'm telescoping this part to be short, because sometimes I can go off for hours on the subprime. And I've got, if you're interested, I've got very long articles that talk about it in some depth. But the thing I would mention is that racial discrimination and gender discrimination plays a role in this. Working with my friend Jesus Hernandez and a co-author, Lisa Mohanty, we documented this for the subprime. There's gender and race discrimination going on, and many of the people getting subprime loans should have qualified for prime loans. So there was discrimination at the source, and that has to do with power. We'll get back to that. Okay. Meanwhile, on this slide, what we show is that essentially there's this transformation of the housing market. You have basically mortgage securitization comes into being. You've got lots and lots of paper being bundled into these securities. This is a system that grows up. So it's a kind of machinery. You know, the market relationships are put into place. There's people in the financial firms whose job it is to move this paper. That famous book we talked about, Liar's Poker, that we were remembering, it comes already from the late 1980s. That's a book that talks about the kind of predatory and crazy atmosphere of Wall Street. That was that one Wall Street. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he was a Solomon. Yeah, so that story that was already present there. That story of that crazy scene on Wall Street, that was already a bond department. So these institutions are built up, and once they are, then they've got to compete to generate rates of return. So they're going to be pumping it and trying to sell their product. So this thing is all set up. Now, at this moment in historical time, what's happening is that we had the IT bubble and then crash in the U.S. Right there, right at the turn of the century, the IT market is crashing badly, and basically there's a danger that the U.S. economy is going to fall into recession, and there had already been fingers pointed at the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Federal Reserve, because back in the early 90s, when basically George, I guess it was Robert Dole, was going to try to become president against Clinton, there was, if you remember, there was an expression from then. Bill Clinton, he said, it's the economy, stupid. And the reason it was the economy was that the Federal Reserve then held a really strict monetary policy, and that economy suffered then. It was in recession, and that was one reason that Bill Clinton won the presidency away from the Republicans, who had been controlling the White House for 12 years. So we get to the new century, to 2000, 2001, there's a new presidential election, and basically the Federal Reserve makes sure that it cannot be blamed for, you know, causing yet another outcome. Now that had to do with something else, but we won't get into that. But basically they pumped it, and what they did is they pumped it, and we went from the crash of the IT bubble to the rise of the housing bubble. So there was a new vehicle for the financial institutions to invest in, and so and they had all the machinery built, and we start to have this rock and roll. Now, we're changing from an old system that basically looks like this to a new system that looks like this. You know, because you need all this stuff. Notice that the bank here is no longer the lender. The lender in this new system is whoever provides the liabilities, or, you know, whoever supports the asset position. But you need somebody to find the loan, to bring it to the bank. The bank then puts it together, bundles it together, turns it into a security, gets some insurance, somebody underwrites it, and then it goes out, and there's a whole phalanx of, you know, Wall Street-based firms that are basically letting this thing go. Now, this is a figure we had yesterday. I just want to bring it back to say that this is part of the reason for that excessive growth of the very largest banks, because they're Wall Street based, and this is a Wall Street based organization now. So that's part of why you see the big ones get bigger and bigger and bigger in that you know, comparison of the first to 25. I think people were here yesterday, so you saw this graph. This is just this graph that takes you from takes the biggest bank in any year down to the 25th biggest bank, and just lays it out just to take a look at what it looks like as a graphic. And then basically the higher it is over here on the left, then the more there's a kind of concentration in your banking system. And you can see that in some sense we can attribute some of the growth of this concentration to mergers and acquisitions, but most of the big ones had been done by then. So most of the action here was actually due to securitization. Okay, wasn't this risky? Wasn't this a problem? Well, yeah, I think it was. Were housing prices going to go up forever? Well, you can always believe that, but actually there was a complex set of circumstances going on. And let me, rather than make you read that prose, basically what I want to just do is say that, well, actually, there was a lot of different things happening in the U.S. economy, and you can see that in every country and in every region. Parts of Mexico City where, for example, housing prices are going through the roof, other parts where they're stagnant, and that's just the normal pattern. The subprime lending was adapted so that it was used both for the stagnant areas and for the skyrocketing areas. And so here's an example. Like, so what we have here, this is the housing prices as measured by the Case-Shiller Housing Index, which is considered the best housing index for the United States. And so what we have here, first of all, here's the overall index, and you're going for 90s, and then you go to 2000, and then here you see the housing bubble, and basically that's, now, it doesn't look like much, but keep in mind that's actually, that high point was a growth as measured by them throughout the country of 22% percentage gain in housing prices in 1 year. And some of these other figures are really big too, so it was a big bubble. In some places, here we got Phoenix and Las Vegas, it was even crazier, 30% a year. And now, and meanwhile, there were other cities though, and I picked out here, Detroit and Cleveland, Middle West cities that were part of the Rust Belt that was really suffering from the globalization of factories and workers out of work. Detroit is a famous basket case. And you can see that here, basically, actually the housing prices barely even go up, but everybody's getting subprime loans. And the consequence of this is that these banks get bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, let's go back to power. There's power in this system because of the centralization and because of the way in which the relationships get reorganized. And this power is basically, we're just gonna have a couple of slides here to talk about this power. But basically, I want to argue that, you know, you saw how, in fact, we got the picture here. This becomes a network. You know, the new lending system shown there on the right is a network, and I want to argue that there's network-based positional power. There's choke points here where the power is controlled, because basically, if you want a loan under the old system, you need to go to your neighborhood lender, knock on the door, find the loan officer, and convince that person that you are a good risk. Now, that's the old days, and it was not a perfect system. But that's the way it worked. It was more localized finance. In this new system, basically, you're going to try to convince Wall Street that you are a good risk. In fact, your riskiness is going to get turned into a number. They call it the FICO score. And so, you know, you got to confront this network. There's no other way around it. You got nowhere else to go. And so that's network-based positional power. And there's choke points here, and I'm going to show you them. The choke points are basically, there's the link between the loan brokers and the loan officers who are proposing loan packages to the borrower. So like at the street level, there you are. You're now actually not in a bank office. You're at a loan broker's office. And you got to convince that person to make you a financing offer. Now, they don't have the power of finance, but they're going to take the offer and they're going to say, they're going to propose it to a bank or another lender, and they're going to consider whether they should add that to their securities portfolio or not, and then bundle it and sell it. And that has to do with whether it meets standard criteria. Now, the thing here is that there's also a second point, and let's lay it out and I'll show you how this thing works. That the mega banks are controlling access to the secondary markets. So the banks, so this thing goes to the banks, and then basically it's then sent out into, it's going to be held like any other piece of paper by what's going to turn out to be the investor that is financing your actual loan. Now, notice that those investors have got rates of return criteria, and the bank needs to move the paper. So let's just go here for a minute and just show you. See, there's that first choke point, and there's your second choke point. Now, the bank's right in the middle, and it's got the positional power. Now, here, this helps us to understand a paradox that would seem to arise, because there was, as the subprime bubble, as the housing bubble gets hotter and hotter, I mean, and there was a point in 2005 and 2006 in California, beautiful California, more than 1/2 of the loans, mortgage loans, were made with 0 down payment. People did not have the money. It's expensive to live in California, and they can't save, so they would borrow for the house, and then they would borrow the down payment. And basically, the rates that they were going to pay on those are negotiated here, but then they have to be moved from the bank into the securities market over here. Now, the thing is, there's a lot of people that get into the business of mortgage brokers and mortgage, real estate agents. The growth, if you track the growth of real estate agents in California, for example, it's crazy. It goes like, there's a bubble of real estate agents. Everybody and their brother is selling real estate, and, and those agents come in all flavors. There's Asian, and there's Latino, and there's African American, and all kinds of real estate agents and mortgage brokers all participating in this system. But the thing is that they can't beat the system, because at the back end, that paper's got to move. And it's got to move to this lender right here. That lender wants to have basically a rate of return that's competitive. That's why they're in the game in the first place. So even though there's a lot of people originating loans on this side, if this bank comes up with some fair and equitable mortgage loans that are below the expected rate of return in the marketplace, That paper's not going to move, and that bank's going to be stuck with that paper. Doesn't want that. So basically, the back end drives the front end. So it's nothing personal. It's just Wall Street insisting on its rate of return. Centralized markets need their return. They got big cars, they got big lives, they got big toys, they go to big restaurants, they pay fancy money for expensive food. They got lifestyle people, they got to support that lifestyle, and they're going to do it on the basis of your mortgage payment. So your mortgage payment better be up to snuff. You're saying, let's be real about that, right? That's the new system. Okay, now, and here's this famous article in the Wall Street Journal documenting that this is the Wall Street Journal, right? This is not the New Left Review. The Wall Street Journal does this. These reporters go out there, and every now and then they actually do some journalism at the Wall Street Journal. And what they show here, check it out, 2007, Brooks and Simon. In 2005, the peak year of the subprime boom, the study says that borrowers with such credit scores got more than half of all, okay, the credit scores are credit scores that basically should qualify them for non-subprime loans. But 55% of all subprime loans were made to these types of people. And then it goes up to 61% the next year, right? Why? Because of that. Right? The back is driving the front. Now, if that's not power, I don't know what is power. It's invisible, right? It's in your everyday life. And, you know, it's something that is built into it. Now, that system, of course, now we move on, and then we get into the crisis. The banks, you know, wobbling 2007, then Bear Stearns fails in May 2007. Then there's a collapse of the asset-backed commercial paper market. It's an interesting story, but no time to tell you that one today. And then we go to the Lehman Brothers collapsing in 2008. Now, there's then a huge amount of activity as basically Tim Geithner steps in, he being the Treasury Secretary at the time, and they work it out and they save the system. I'm sorry, Geithner was at the Fed. It was Paulson at the Treasury, but then Geithner switches to the Treasury, and between the two of them, they basically make sure that these institutions survive, and they do that in part by the old-fashioned remedy of mergers. Merrill Lynch has failed, so they're sold to Bank America. Why? Well, Bank America doesn't really have a serious mortgage broker-dealer relationship. They've been pretty much of a commercial bank, retail bank enterprise. So by buying Merrill Lynch in the middle of the crisis, they get themselves geared up as a proper mega bank, a mega bank that operates in all fields across the markets. Wachovia is sold to Wells Fargo and other things. Wells Fargo buys other stuff too. Now the thing is that in the midst of that crisis, things get so crazy that in the U.S. system, the way that you can ensure somebody's too big to fail, if you remember, and I'm going to pass the PowerPoints over to, I think, Dr. Correa, and we can make sure that they're available as you need them. But if you look back at that, you will see that the too big to fail statute was run through the Deposit Insurance Fund, the FDIC. So in order to properly qualify for too big to fail under the statutes and laws of the United States, you have to be somehow designated a bank that is a depository, that accepts deposits. Now this is kind of a problem here because two of the big banks that fail, actually more than two, MetLife is an insurance company, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs here are basically investment banks, and they don't have any depository relationships. They're not fiduciaries. They're not taking care of people's money, but they are systematically important. And if they fail, the thought is that the whole system is going to go down. So basically, they are turned into bank holding companies. Like, poof, you're a bank holding company. You're now protected. What's been the result? Okay, let's check it out. So this is what happens, right? The loan growth collapses in the U.S. banking system. It's kind of a, you know, you go, it's like there's Niagara Falls and you go over the falls and things are slowing down. But what's happening here is that during this time period, there's basically, if I picked up the big four U.S. banks, so that's Wells Fargo, Morgan, or rather Chase, let me say, and Citibank, and then Bank America. Those big four, those are the big four lenders. And notice that what I did here is just to take the loans made by these big four in a couple of different categories. These are loans to individuals. Actually, I think I just did one graph just for it, because they're all pretty much the same. And what you see is that basically the big four, they move over these years. First, they grow because they're more aggressively making loans with their concentrated power. But then once the system collapses, then there are some mergers that allow them to take an even larger market share of the U.S. system. They're making 70% of the loans to individuals in 2010. But here's the thing about it, is that these are not, okay, so what we got here, these are not your everyday banks. What we got here is the following. Okay, we lay out from left to right the big six. Okay, the six biggest banks in the U.S. Bank America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo. We then add in Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, which are the next two. Those are the two former investment banks that are formerly, that are now formally inside the system as bank holding companies. Now, just for reference, I picked up some Pier 1, like basically Pier 1 is like basically big banks, big bank holding companies. And these are just like SunTrust is a Florida bank, BB&T is in Tennessee, and Fifth Third Bank Corp is in Cincinnati, Ohio. I mean, headquartered there. So they're just like three typical banks. Okay, what we're doing here, core deposits as a percentage of assets. And you can see for Bank of America, it's, 40% or so. So how important are deposits? For J.P. Morgan Chase, it's substantial, but less than half. For Wells Fargo, actually, that's the only one that looks like a Pier 1 company. They look like the other ones. Citigroup, you can see they don't have much deposits. They buy most of their money, but then these guys have like almost nothing. Now, when we look at who's making loans, we get the same contrast. We get, in this case, that Wells Fargo is the only one that is mostly making loans. Lots of the assets of Bank America, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citigroup are basically devoted to non-loan commitments. And basically throughout the U.S. banking system, it's around 68% is the typical percentage of loans on a balance sheet. And again, these guys aren't playing that game. So you ask yourself, what game are they playing? Okay, here's an answer. They're playing this game. Derivatives as a percentage of assets. Now notice that over here, we had a number like 80%, okay? Now check out the left-hand column right now. Is that 6,000? Yeah, that's 6,000%. Derivatives as a percentage of assets. Oh, there's Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. And they're carrying along with them their competitors, because these are now the big boys, the most powerful banks in the world, competing with one another for a market share. And these, because now you got your credit default swap, department, you got your interest rate swap market, you got all these markets, you got over the counter, you got exchange traded, you got assets, you got asset managers, you got all this stuff, and you're trying to make money on all those fronts, so you got to compete if you want to do it. Now notice that Wells Fargo is the one that looks more like a traditional bank, although in the last few days we just got news that in being a traditional bank they were actually ripping people off, but that's another story for another time. And here's your interest rate swaps. Same story. So you've let some foxes into the chicken coop. But it turns out that when you let them in, here's some chickens over here, but see, these are not too big to fail banks. Those are just everyday banks, so they got to take care of things. But these banks are too big to fail, so let's party. Now, what do you do about it, right, is the next part of our story. And essentially, what we see is a laydown by the economics profession. French and a whole bunch of people go away to a place called Squam Lake. And this is like everybody from, I don't know, like there's, all these finance people and famous people, semi-famous people, and it was like the great thinkers go away to a lake in Utah? I don't know where Squam Lake is. They probably surrounded by Mormons with machine guns, I guess. But and they came back with a plan, and Darrell Duffy, who's at Stanford, came up with a similar thing. Basically, their plan is what we should do is permit wide-ranging activities by financial conglomerates, but design incentive or punishment mechanisms in the various sub-areas of financial activity to avoid dangerous excess. Now think back to the, Latin American debt crisis. Wasn't this the thing? You got a principal-agent problem. We need a good solution. Remember, this was just yesterday we were talking about that. Remember that? It's not going to work unless the punishment is high enough. So make a high punishment, and then they'll be good boys and girls. They'll do their homework. They won't rip off poor people. They won't rip off black people. They won't rip off anybody. They'll be good forever. Believe that. You don't believe that. I don't either. Now, the other option is actually, weirdly, provided by this guy, Robert Shiller. Now, Robert Shiller is described by many as a Keynesian. He works with Akerlof. These people are very important in the INET. And expectations, Keynes, confidence, and all this. But look at Shiller. Shiller says the key problem is not the size or complexity of the firms serving the market, but the structure of markets that's available to meet banking needs. Simplify the financial contracts, establish futures and derivatives markets that allow everyday people to hedge their bets. Okay, here's what he's talking about. You are going to go buy a house, Julio, I know you want to make a lot of money fast. So what you do is you go to, let's say Detroit, and you buy a bunch of houses at a low price, and then you say, okay, it looks good, but I might have some danger in case Detroit goes down rather than goes up. So let me go to the Detroit housing market, futures market, and buy some futures, and basically to ensure my position, because there's going to be, when you buy it, there's going to be an expectation that there'll be a certain stable house price in Detroit. So you find somebody who's willing to take the risk. So you pay your insurance price, just like any of these instruments, and that person then has the risk that your housing price will go down. If the housing price does go down, you implement your derivative contract and you're all set. Now just think about that. What does Julio need? Well, if he's buying some houses, he's going to need, and if he really wants to be covered, he's going to need derivatives contracts that are going to extend 20 or 30 years into the future. Are there such derivatives markets? Check it out. Now, the answer, by the way, is no. Even in the big markets, they don't go out that far. But in Detroit, really, there's going to be a robust market with depth and scope and activity, and it's going to be deep, and it's going to be there, and he can easily trade. He can unwind his position as he chooses. If he gets scared about what's going to happen, I don't think so. Oh, then we're going to have one for Cleveland, and we're going to have one for Minneapolis, and we're going to have one for Akron, Ohio, and we're going to have one for Ashtabula, Ohio. What the hell are we talking about? Robert Shiller? Really? Perfect those markets? Oh, by the way, yeah, okay, let's not get into who's making money where, but just one guess. And he's a very nice guy, teaches at Yale. He's very nice, very suave. It's more or less the Oxford, Cambridge of the US. Okay, then we passed the law. Now I'm going to skip some things. Basically, there's a very restricted debate, but in the end, who writes the Dodd-Frank Act that's supposed to make everything better is essentially the lawyers who work for the Big Six. The Dodd-Frank Act is about this thick, and essentially it's got 5,000 pages. It's written by those people, and once they pass it in 2010, after all this crazy negotiation, they then promulgate regulations. There are protests to the regulations. They're fought, and that act is not even fully implemented today, 6 years later. In fact, the outstanding promise of the Republican caucus going into the next presidential election is to repeal Dodd-Frank. Well, you know, hell, the lawyers wrote it, but you know, there's lawyers, and there's always some money to be made there too. But the thing about it is, and the thing that was the big rule that was at stake was this thing called the Volcker rule. Now, it would be sweet to follow Paul Volcker all the way through, because Paul Volcker turns from the scourge of the capitalist world, the scourge of Latin America back in the 70s, you know, when he did his trick and then blew up the international financial sector. By 2005, Paul Volcker, if you check it out, it's Washington Post 2005, before the crisis. He writes an article called "Banking on Thin Ice," and you got to read it, because he plays now the role. You know how, like he comes back, like he goes up to the mountain, like a Japanese novel, and he comes back. Let's see, what's that? 2005. That's, well, it's 23 years later, and he comes down from the mountain, and he's now like this old wizard, and he's got this cape, and he just says, "We're all going to die. We're banking on thin ice. Every day we consume more and more, but it's out of control." And he basically says, what we got to do is we got to get these banks under control, and we need to pass something that becomes called the Volcker rule. The Volcker rule is a rule that says that the bank holding companies cannot trade on their own account. No proprietary trading. But this draws a furious response, and they basically, although it looks like the Volcker rule was passed, actually it was not. Now, what do we make of it? Okay, now here's where you really see how the power moves in part through the ability of the banks to put pressure at the point of borrowing and lending, as we saw. But power also takes the form of being able to control the discourse about what just happened. So we determine what's in your laws, and then we determine what the high officials are going to say about that. So let's turn to Tim Geithner, U.S. Treasury Secretary, at an event in Atlanta talking about the banking reform that just passed. Okay, are you ready now? But check out the key words here. The U.S. financial system is recovering because of the tough choices we made to fundamentally restructure the system. Okay, want to rewind that? Because of the tough choices we made. Okay, I don't remember seeing any tough choices. It seems like you bailed out all the big guys, and you bailed out everybody that needed bailing out, and you let them merge with each other, and we say you have the same system in place. And if you'll notice, by the way, notice that like these bars here don't actually get noticeably smaller after the crisis. Actually, they get kind of bigger. So tough choices? Oh. Yeah. Well, what do you mean by tough? You know? So, but okay, back to Tim Geithner. Because of the tough choices we made to fundamentally restructure the system, we put in place the reforms necessary to preserve those changes with a better balance of stability and innovation. The weaker parts of the U.S. financial system, the firms that took the most risk, no longer exist or have been significantly restructured. It's beautiful. You know, it's a big lie. It's the big lie. But then, okay, now here's the story though. So this is kind of a crazy statement, right? Like, I'm going to redefine your reality right now. We took care of everything. Okay, and if you just permit me for a minute, there's a bank that was one of the banks that was created back in 1970 by a guy called Krzyzewski in Chicago. Chicago is one of the worst places for racial redlining against blacks and Latinos. Chicago, Illinois. This guy Krzyzewski was this visionary Polish-American, proud to say, and he started South Shore Bank, or he took it over, and they made South Shore Bank a bank that actually made loans in this area of Chicago. It's South Chicago. If you've been to Chicago, you know that's the dark side of town. That's where you got the blues bars. And so they were making loans in that part of Chicago. They made loans to black people, and they were successful. Okay, now, flash forward. There's long stories here, but let's just go forward. Where does President Obama have his own personal house? South Shore, Chicago. Where did he get the mortgage loan for that house? South Shore Bank. Okay, that's kind of a typical story. Middle class or upper middle class African-American family gets their loan. Okay, good. Now let's go forward. Guess what one of the banks was that failed and was not bailed out and not even having made subprime loans, but being in a neighborhood that was affected by subprime loans? Guess what that bank was that failed and that was now apparently the weakest parts of the U.S. financial system, the ones that took the most risk? Yeah, South Shore Bank. South Shore Bank fails. Who's president? President Obama. We could ask a question like, okay, President Obama, is your house like fully paid for, or do you now have to make like a mortgage payment to another bank because they stripped out the bank that was supposed to be doing virtuous reinvestment work back where you live, back in the hood? I know you got bigger things on your mind, brother, but come on. All right. Next. Now, here's what happens. Okay, we'll do that. Now, what we got is, at that same hearing, Jamie Dimon, you remember him, the head of Chase Bank, he's sitting in the audience. Geithner doesn't know he's there. And he stands up, and, okay, we got to do Jamie Dimon. Okay, now remember, this guy, he is a performer. So he stands up, and he's already starting to cry. He just can't take it. He goes like this. Okay, you ready? I'm going to read this so you get the full effect. Because he's, you know, higher capital requirements for large banks, such as his own. Has anyone bothered to study the cumulative effects of all these things? Which his lawyers wrote, by the way. And do you have a fear, like I do, that when we look back on them, they will be the reason that it took so long that our banks, our credit, our businesses, and most importantly, job creation started going again? He's something, right? That guy's in, you check him out, he's in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal almost every week pushing the agenda. Okay, then they had the London whale and they just forgot about everything. Okay, so we have this plutocracy that goes along. I'm going to skip this part because we're going to get to the good part. I just want to come and touch shadow banking for a little while, then we're going to get to the reform agenda. Basically, shadow banking, here's this famous definition. It's all the institutions that do what banks used to do. They lend and they put together savings, but they're not actually banks nor regulated as banks. And so credit intermediation, as the Financial Stability Board puts it, that involves entities outside the regular banking system. But what I want to mention is that, okay, I'm not going to, don't read this page, but in the 1933 and then amended 1947 Securities and Exchange Acts of the United States, there are loopholes. And the loopholes where you don't have to report, you don't have to tell anybody what you're doing. The shadow banks exist as responses to those loopholes. They are people that basically make loans that are unaccountable. So yeah, they're part of the normal banking system, but they're also outside of the banking system and looking for the freedom to do what they want to do. So basically, now I've got some figures and it could show you that most of the shadow banking loans that are held right now are outside the system. But now, here's a vortex of risk that basically seems to arise when we have, this is a negative vortex. Now this is a guy at the Dallas Federal Reserve talking about this vortex of risk and all the things that can happen from a dysfunctional financial system. But now that vortex of risk, you know, what we've basically done with the shadow banking and the securitization complex is, you know, back in the day, the sources of funds over here on the left, deposits, were closely linked. They were right next to the uses of funds. That's how it worked. Now we have this shadow banking system that sits between. Now everybody here, right, you got asset-backed securities, intermediaries, issuance, warehousing, all this stuff. Everybody here is getting paid because you have this whole, as you saw, network taking care of this system. And you know what was a simple system becomes a more complicated system, and basically I just drew a line around there to show you that the large complex banks are at the heart of it. So they've made themselves, you know, basically, it's unthinkable to have this financial system without them in it. You can't pull them out. And here's another way of saying this. And basically, it's recognized, this is a quote from this article written in 2012. And basically, so this is a Federal Reserve economist, I think it's Green, and he writes, at each step in the process of shadow intermediation, the true quality of the underlying collateral is further obscured. You know, how good this loan is harder and harder and harder to see. The end buyer, over here, holds a very small slice of a very large number of loans. In theory, this diversifies risk because any single loan going bad will have little effect on the total pool's value. However, this also complicates the evaluation of individual pieces, leaving investors to rely on aggregate data. These data were manipulated and unreliable. And basically, this is just, you know, they already knew this, 2005, but this is still the system. And of course, it goes to the idea that the big banks get bigger. Now, and shadow banking activity now is larger, if you measure it the right way, than banking activity. Essentially, let's forget that. What I do want to do, though, is, so you ask yourself, who's making loans anymore? Well, okay, you saw that. That red line, that's shadow banking. Those are liabilities. It's the borrowing of those institutions on the market. But let's check it out, and let's see who's doing banking. Okay, this is my favorite. You've probably seen this, Dwayne, because I love this picture. But, okay, picture tells a million stories. Okay, so basically what we have here is we take business cycles, 1960, 70, 74, 80, and we got GDP growth, average GDP growth through the rising part of the business cycle. Then we've got net loan growth. Now notice that this is for U.S. banks. Notice that GDP growth, first of all, it's slowing down, but secondly, notice that basically loan growth is always more. Now this makes sense. If you study Keynesian theory, and we have the theory of endogenous money, that money is created by firms as they engage in business and by, you know, to make loans and so on. And basically, so there's loan growth to facilitate economic growth, the way it's supposed to work. And this is commercial and industrial loans, real estate loans, and loans to individuals. So across the board, loan growth. Okay, now you know why I'm showing you this, because this is those four business cycles. We're now going to move forward. You ready? Okay, keep your eyes, just remember these shapes, right? That's what happens. Basically, GDP growth slows down even more, as you see. Net loan growth, okay, only in the middle one, that's 2001-07, that's when they were making all these real estate loans. And basically, otherwise, the only loans they're really making are loans to individuals. Loans to business actually disappear, net terms. Okay, so we have power and finance that we got to deal with. Okay, now basically, you know, you've got, as we said, the problem is a disempowered state, disempowered people, versus this kind of empowered, mobile, surplus extracting, fee generating financial capital complex. And the cautious re-regulation is too slow. And basically, let's go back now. I think what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to whip through this. I'm just going to show you something. What I want to show you, though, is that basically we were talking about, you know, we're connecting the dots. And I told you about how back when you had the Latin American crisis, there was this problem of all these kinds of loans being very different one to another, and something had to be done in order to turn them into essentially securities that could be moved off of bank balance sheets. And this is this fellow Buchheit, who's a lawyer who specialized back then in understanding how this worked. And he describes here the problem. Thousands of credits have to be separately negotiated with individual banks. Really hard. these banks are all over the world, subject to differing regulatory and disclosure regimes with different lending policies, right? So that's a problem to be solved. Basically, what he shows is that, now just go down to this sentence right here. What has happened only through a consensus among the participants without the benefit of any outside policy-making authority or enforcement mechanism. Basically, there's been dramatic effects of this crisis. We're still back in 1988. The international banking community has learned to act as a more or less unitary creditor group. What is crucial here, just to skip to the end, credit agreements should reflect the bank's entitlement to regard themselves as lenders to the country as a whole, not just separate borrowers within the country. Now that guy is still active, and he's a hell of a guy. Can you read that quote? The market moves so fast. Hedge funds have the attention span of a Peruvian chinchilla. Nice, right? I just randomly came up with that reference. You can see he likes to play it. Okay, now let's go. Okay, we have a higher power. We're going to skip this, and basically this is just a quote from Blankfein that shows that, you know, we have power. We're not a fiduciary. We're not an agent. We're a principal. We take care of ourselves. Now that's a guy, right, who's at a bank holding company. And in doing so, okay, he basically just, this is Blankfein a couple months later in India, just talking about how these are just the standards of the moment. And there he is. Now, okay, final part of our series. We're going to first talk about, I talked about we need a new model. As I tried to sit down and think about it, I think we got to think in terms of transitions. And so, you know, our problem is, that, right, this is where the Hendrix comes in. Got to be a way out of here. We got to find our way out of here before we can get to another place. And we have countries in place that are looking for an escape. And so, you know, what's our problem? And let's focusing in on developing countries. You got austerity fiscal policy, and that's there especially in the global north nations. The weak growth makes the financial fragility worse, and credit flows from the higher income countries to developing countries have slowed. Human beings are more on the move, right? So there's that whole phenomenon. And in fact, now remittances, where people are moving from the lesser or crisis areas to other areas, now become part of the scene. Now, just to show you, first of all, here's a picture of, this is the emerging economies growth, and this is the developed economies growth. And what you see is that everything is slowing down, but the global economic growth has been dependent on the emerging economies. So as they go down, the system slows down. And these trends are, you know, undercutting the capacity of governments to care for their residents. Basically we have these circles of budget cuts. And governments are now perceived, as we noted, something that emerged in the Latin American debt crisis. They're just another borrower. They must be disciplined. In fact, you know, Trump came out with this crazy proposal yesterday, which was regarded immediately with skepticism. What was the proposal? Let's have subsidized child care, you know, because his beloved daughter has 3 children, and he wants her to be fine, and he'd like the government to take care of her child care costs. That's actually like a nice little proposal, right? Let's do that for everybody. Why not? It's part of the care budget, and it could be good for productivity, lots of things. What was the first question? I had the misfortune of listening to CNN last night, and what the first thing they said? How are you going to pay for that? Right? It's a sovereign government. How are you going to pay for that? Okay, so that mentality goes deep, deep, deep. And, you know, what we need is something that, you know, recruits humanity to like a race to the moon. You know, how can we imagine this, much less build it? Now, here's a summary of the consensus at the minute among the economists of the world. I figure I've got like 10 minutes, 15 at most. Yeah, we're good to go. All right, so this is a consensus at the minute. Now, interestingly, We talked about yesterday, we had some critique of the IMF, and we talked about the fact that the IMF wants to be the global think tank as well as being the global policeman. And this is something that's, part of their kind of, psychosis. They want it both ways. It's control, right? So let's look through and see. The IMF is going to play an important role here, but let's go down the list. So, austerity macro policy. So one of our problems here is that the global north is slowing down. The global south is slowing down because the global north is slowing down. And China, of course, plays a complicated double role in that story. It counts as the developing economy, but its slowdown permeates through the growth patterns of all the countries with whom it trades. It is now Brazil's most important trade partner, for example. So, that kind of thing. So basically, austerity macro policy in the developed economies would be, is something you say, well, do they need to be that way? Do they need to keep cutting their budgets? Okay. Well, one reason would be that there was this scare put out that there's a threshold that if sovereign debt becomes more than 90% of income, that growth is going to slow down. It's a statistical fact. Now, my former department mate, Bob Poland, and his students showed that that was not true. And Barry Eichengreen, just in this very nice recent book, has a page where he goes through these things. No. Is there a threshold? No, there's not. Especially there's no threshold when borrowing is cheap and you've got underemployed resources. Secondly, is there evidence that austerity can actually expand the macroeconomy? And the answer is this thing was put out by a couple of economists, Tabellini and somebody else, Andrea, I forget the names, but it's basically based on a very special case use of data for very small countries at transition points. And basically the overall evidence, does austerity increase the macroeconomy? No. So no, that doesn't work. Now, how about expansionary fiscal policy? Is there space? For example, Britain could rebuild its railway system. They could renew their national health system and other things. So that's what they could do. They have needs. Does expansionary fiscal policy have a multiplier greater than 1? In other words, if you do it in a globalized world, will it work? Now, here's where the IMF steps in. They've got a new book that's just been published by MIT Press. The authors here are IMF people, but these IMF people, there's actually a whole series of co-authors. This was like a collective effort of their research department. And essentially, for example, Croco was really happy to see this book because basically here's what it says. Under two conditions, expansionary policy, fiscal policy, can have a multiplier greater than 1. Number one, a very deep recession, such as the 2008, 2009. Number two, in a mild recession or under stagnation, it can have an effect, but only if there's coordinated multilateral expansionary policy. The book is called Post-Crisis Fiscal Policy. It's a really important book because, I mean, they're still the IMF. They're still a pain in the ass. It's, 500 pages of blah, 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 model, and numbers. But basically, with all of that, they come to a different conclusion than they have in the past. Now, as we were talking about yesterday, there's a war between the research department and the operational department. And so, but this is the research department kind of putting a marker in there. This would have been during Olivier Blanchard's time as the chief economist. And actually, if you follow Olivier Blanchard, you know that he too is bipolar, or however you call that. He goes back and forth between Jekyll and Hyde. But in that moment, an IMF isn't going to do more, but this is an important marker. And then the final thing is, question, can you do it all with monetary policy, as they're trying to do right now? And the answer is no. No, you can't. Claudio Borio talks about this, Richard Fisher, other people talk about it. No, it doesn't work. You can have all the confidence-generating measures you want. It's not going to be enough. So there's three conclusions from these studies. First of all, austerity fiscal policy is not expansionary. Expansionary fiscal policy is feasible, even in the open economies that we have today, but it's got to be coordinated by the largest economies, those that can stand up, let's say, to the financial power that we have today. And thirdly, monetary policy cannot do it all. And furthermore, of course, monetary policy flows through the banking system, flows through those mega banks. And you saw the pictures about loan growth. Why are they surprised when they do monetary quantitative easing and there's no lending, right? All you got to do is just go back and remember that picture and say, oh yeah, they haven't been doing any lending for business for a long damn time. Why do you think they're going to start now? Just saying. I mean, part of it is, okay, we have global uncertainty and so on and so on. But basically, these people have not been reliable intermediaries for policy for a long time. And to rely on monetary policy that assumes that these banks are what they are not, after they've captured the commanding heights of the loan growth country after country after country. I mean, I don't have time to show you the stats, but the shadow banking system is even bigger in some of the European countries, relatively speaking, than in the US. Who are we kidding? I mean, this is just a way to basically save the balance sheets of the big banks. Okay. Now, the structural fix for the developing economies, of course, is that you got often high debt levels that are there. But while that is true, while there's high debt levels, even that, in developing countries, they're often higher in the other countries, but debt crises are more common and more dangerous. And the reason is you've got financially fragile agents and less welfare state provisions. So private debt, expanding fast, also turns into public debt when your crisis comes. And basically, when crises come, the governments in developing economies have less policy space. Now, just to show you, here's gross public debt. And see, here's the interesting thing. The major advanced economies actually have the most debt. The advanced economies generally are next in line. There's the world figure. And here's Latin America, the Caribbean, emerging Asia, and then other. So, the debt is more in the global north, but it's more dangerous in the global south. And here's some figures showing the rapid growth of credit to GDP, including Mexico here, and there's China and Malaysia, and there's some other countries. So it's getting more. Now notice that the scale over here, Brazil, India, and so on, is a higher scale. That's a piece of it. And then policy space. Basically, the further away you are from ground zero here, the more policy space you've got. And what this basically just shows is that the red dotted line of the emerging economies, they have less policy space than the other economies. So they have less room to move. Meanwhile, there's financial competition going on and a furious strategic repositioning. These banks are not shrinking, they're repositioning. And what we have here then is kind of a slowdown of growth, but actually there is first cross-border claims and flows. Wealth is getting more mobile, workers are getting more mobile, people are moving around, and things are really changing. Now let me just show you something. Claims on local borrowers, so local lending, has actually, there's been a kind of localization of lending, and cross-border claims are really going down. So local loans are growing, and cross-border claims, especially the black and the gray there, are the US and the Euro area banks, and then the Asia Pacific there. But basically, cross-border claims are declining. Now what's happening though is that if loans are less moving across the world, what's increasing is the movement of people. Now, okay, we're almost at the end of our story here, and we're going to get to the solutions part, but just check this out, because this is important. You have a refugee crisis. We started yesterday with that seemingly beautiful picture of those people isolated on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean Ocean. But check this out. Outflows of remittances. Highest in, because this is something that we used to talk about a lot in the US. and there's the U.S. right there. But notice that Europe is higher. The Gulf nations are higher. Now let's go and let's look at 3 countries inside Europe. So Europe has taken the lead. And within Europe, check it out. Northern European Euro area nations have the highest, within Europe, have the highest flow rates of remittances. That's already true. This is before we have the refugee inflow the last couple of years. And there's, so that's something that, and then there's your non-Euro nations. So in Europe, you're seeing this remittance phenomenon that's happening. How about the inflows of remittances? Well, very high for Asia. There's Latin America in black, but look, more in Russia, more in other places, more in Europe. So we're in a world in which remittances are becoming more and more important, and there too, Northern Europe at the top of the pop. So, Northern Europe is, in the midst of this cyclical change, and their countries have not caught up with the fact that this has already happened. You can't protect a Germany that's in your mind, which of course you invented after World War II anyway. That's already gone. So, let's just conclude to how are we going to do a transitional model. Okay, first of all, the big countries, US, Europe, and Japan, could undertake coordinated expansionary spending. They can do it by generating green growth. They could rebuild their infrastructures. They could deal with global warming. Until they do, right, they got the power and they got the mass. That's where most of the dollar flows are. And if they could stimulate their economies, they will, on the one hand, help the other economies through remittance payments, flows, but on the other hand, they will pull along the rest of the global economy. We should probably put China in there too, although China is a complicated case. Public deficits are going to happen, and that's going to be there, but basically, we can expect that basically that is going to be something we can look for, and we need some mechanisms for debt resolution to be put in place. And that's, this triggers other forces. So basically, households basically are bearing the cost of these reduced services all the time, and they're at most risk. So we have to stabilize households. And basically, we also have to address the problem of these new legal structures of lending or extra legal structures of lending. We got to get that under control. The case of Argentina shows where things are. So, we basically have a situation where new lending instruments are not going to solve the problem. The disempowering of governments that cannot already meet human needs and pay off their debt is disabling developing economies' capacity to build these economic futures. We need something else. And so essentially, let's have that coordinated expansion by those global north countries, including China perhaps, as a kind of race to the moon moment. Let's make new research and investment initiatives that address causes of global warming. How about in every country? If we don't do that, we don't really deserve our great-grandchildren. And guess where those refugees are coming from today, and guess where they're going to continue to come from? You need prosperity around the world, and that can be financed and that can be imagined, but it's got to be led. And so we need new multilateral mechanisms to move finance where it's needed. So stronger nations are less subject to global financial markets approval or disapproval. They got to get that under control. And these stronger nations, if they want to save their children's futures, they got to see that the way to do that is to save the future of children throughout the world who are only a boat ride away anyway. Now, Model 2, this is just going to be a page, I think. So those transitions, now what will it take to get those big global economies to see that we need coordinated expansion? What moment is it that leads, Wolfgang Schäuble to come to his senses? He may not, but will an angry electorate overthrow him and his power in Bavaria and his control over Merkel and policies there in Germany? It's not going to happen in 2018. Could things be bad enough by 2022, the next German election? Maybe. So we're looking at something that's going to take a little while to play out. We've got to hang tight, because there's going to be some bad years ahead. You know, and as mentioned, the hour's getting late. So essentially, just 4 points. Thinking farther forward. We got to rethink the basis of value and distribution. You know, the beginning point where we started on Monday was a recognition in the old classical systems that distribution and value are socially determined. You know, we didn't have time to elaborate that technically, but that is the case. There is a social determination of economic outcomes. It's not that economic outcomes constrain and delimit what we can think about as the social. We've got to do this with a renewal of democratic voice. It's got to be bottom up. And for that to work, you need global prosperity. You have to have Bangladeshis who are going to stay in Bangladesh and who don't need to leave that country when it starts to go underwater, as it's already been going underwater since I was there in 1992, and you couldn't even see where the land ended and the sea began back then. You know, are there ways that you can work with that? Are there engineers who are thinking about that? Yeah. Do they have the foreign currency to deal with that? No. You know, can you have more and more textile factories to save that? No. You got to think bigger. You got to think globally. You know, what will make a prosperous Bangladesh? What will make a prosperous Papua New Guinea, et cetera, et cetera. And I think then now Paul Mason, with his post-capitalism, has the vision that you're going to see a collapse of the markets. I don't see that necessarily myself, but it does seem to me that it would be important to take prices for non-renewable resources and to do them differently and to make that stick globally. Now again, how can that work? How can that be organized? I am not sure, because at the same time, what we need to do globally is get the power of finance under control. That burden is really with the large nations that are now dependent on that, that financial complex for their prosperity, and that includes the UK and the US. And the UK is about to have a giant shock as the City of London no longer has access to the Europe, its European vital space, because of the decision that its frustrated voters made. So voter revolt undercuts the capacity to sustain an unsustainable economic complex. That is going to happen around the world. And finally, you know, to make this a globally sustainable prosperity situation, we're going to have a situation where we bring in some form of Keynes-Bancor plan where there's some agreement that the nations who are winning from having surpluses are forced to do what Yanis Varoufakis likes to call global recycling or regional recycling. Who could do that? Maybe China. If you go and look at the speeches of the Chinese central bank president, he doesn't want to see the renminbi as the next global currency. That's not going to work. London tried to make a deal where they'd have the pound as like their, like, you know, sort of local version, like we'll take care of your global financial needs. That's not going to work. They can't, it's not going to work that way. Their banking system will collapse if you made it compete square up with Wall Street and City of London. But what could happen is that China could insist that that's the only operating system, and they may have the global clout in terms of the flows of income, demand, etc., to insist that everybody play by the rules. Okay, a world in which China disciplines the US and Europe and Brazil and these other governments to actually have sustainable prosperity? I don't know. But I can't think of another one, because it's not that we invent nations, they come from outer space. And we got, and you know, India right now is basically under the control of basically kind of a thug who is, and with a system whose own racial ethnic constraints bar its growth. China has got a militarized, independently controlled, party-run state where it's top-down, but there's still the authority in place. We got to work with those people until they collapse. And I think in some weird way, would it be that if we work with the Chinese Communist Party so that they retain their control, can they keep their kleptocracy under control? Can they do virtuous good for the global system? See, that's where my thinking ends. I'm not sure. And I know that I wouldn't want to live in China myself. But I'm not sure if there's another move. Because ultimately, their system is just as in danger of unsustainability as any other. And we're all racing to destruction. And as Jimi Hendrix put it, the hour is growing late. Thank you very much, and we open it up.
Bueno, le damos muchas gracias a todos por su asistencia aquí. A diferencia de los 2 días anteriores, no vamos a tener preguntas. El doctor tiene un día muy ocupado hoy, entonces nos vamos corriendo. Pero espero que ya quienes han asistido han podido desahogar sus preguntas. Igual como acaba de comentar, va a ser disponible sus presentaciones para quien esté interesado en consultarlos. El doctor es una persona muy ocupada, pero también es muy accesible, entonces espero que puedan aprovechar de haberlo conocido para estar en contacto por correo, cualquier cosa. Sobre todo, es un gran lujo tener al doctor aquí. Realmente esos asuntos de los que está hablando realmente determinan el poder en el cúspide pues, del poder mundial, entonces son de gran interés para todos. Es un académico que lleva años acertando y llevando la buena lucha académico-intelectual hasta donde se puede, influyendo en la política pública y seguramente va a seguir haciéndolo y vamos a seguir escuchando de él, aunque desde lejos. Entonces, creo que no queda mucho más, que le damos las gracias a todos. Le vamos a entregar a la doctora Correa, quien invitó el evento, las conferencias, le va a entregar su constancia y le damos un gran aplauso por tomar el tiempo de venir aquí. Gracias.
Bueno, a nombre de la universidad, por supuesto, y a nombre también de todos nosotros y sobre todo de todo el apoyo que recibimos logístico del posgrado de Economía, del ingeniero Jesús y de todos los, de Valeria y de todos los que hicieron posible que este seminario se lleve a cabo. Muchas gracias, Gary. Thank you, Gary, and welcome here to Mexico in any time.